Well, welcome everybody to this evening's webinar. We're very fortunate to have Court Assistant Paul Wilson talk to us tonight, the subject being the printers, the priest, and the Indian princess. We've all been looking forward to this, and I will now pass over to Paul, who will speak to you, and then the master will end the proceedings. Paul, over to you.
Thank you very much, Giles. Very neatly done. Well, good evening, everybody, and welcome to this year's History Talk. I'd like to thank the Library and Archives Committee, and in particular Claire Scott, our fellow stationer, for inviting me to give this talk, which this year comes courtesy of Zoom. Anyway, so let's get straight onto this. As you can see, the title slide acknowledges the fact that we're not meeting in St Martin's. Here it's St Martin's far beyond Ludgate. It also alludes to the theme of this evening's talk, the role of St Martin's and one of its incumbents in bringing vast amounts of knowledge of the furthest reaches of the earth, its geography, peoples, religions, languages, fauna, trade and history to the people of England at a crucial time in the early 17th century, at a time when England was starting to trade with the Far East and to put down settlements in the New World. It was a time when English seamen started to engage in whaling at the island of Spitsbergen. The East India Company competed with its Dutch rival for the trade of what is now Indonesia and secured England's first trade agreement with Japan, which now seems very topical. The first English ambassador was around about this time also sent to the Mughal Emperor. At this time, England was at an early stage in its efforts to catch up with its competitors. Its continental rivals had not only put down roots in the New World 100 years before England was to do so, but were decades, if not generations ahead of England in circumnavigating the earth, in studying foreign cultures and languages, in cartography, and of course, in improving the techniques of printing. Since about 1577, England had started to emerge slowly from its backwardness. In that year, Francis Drake had embarked on his circumnavigation of the earth, and John Dee, the mathematician and Elizabeth I's astrologer, published his book, Perfect Art of Navigation, promoting the idea of a British Empire. An early attempt to settle Roanoke Island in what is now North Carolina under the sponsorship of Walter Raleigh had failed by 1590, but in the previous year, the clergyman Richard Hakluyt had published a milestone work, The Principal Navigations, Voyages and Discoveries of the English Nation, propagating a myth of the English as a leading nation of explorers and encouraging colonization and trade. This work, which somewhat hyped up the English achievements overseas, was supported by the patronage of Elizabeth I's ministers, Cecil and Walsingham, and it urged ambition on the hitherto seemingly unambitious and inward-looking English, and marked a change in the way the English saw themselves in the world. Tonight, we'll look at another milestone in England's efforts to understand the wider world and to promote an interest in overseas settlement and trade across huge distances. And we'll look not only at the author and at his sources of information, but also at his publisher and printer, without whom this ambitious work would have been unachievable. But first, we'll begin with the arrival in London of this young lady in all her Jacobean finery. So, Rebecca Rolfe, also named here as Matawarka, is of course no other than Pocahontas. From the middle of 1616 to early 1617, Matawarka visited London with her husband, John Rolfe, the first Englishman to cultivate tobacco successfully in the new settlement of Virginia, and thus the first successful businessman based in English-speaking North America. Matawarka's time in London was the equivalent then of a visit by a Hollywood A-lister or a senior foreign politician today. She was greeted by James I in his court and by the Virginia Company, which contributed towards the cost of her stay. Having converted to Christianity, she was also welcomed by the Bishop of London. It's generally believed that Rolfe and Matawarka lodged at an inn called the Belle Sauvage on the north side of Ludgate Hill, and that she visited St Martin's within Ludgate. The inn had been known as Savage's in the late Middle Ages and was used as a playhouse in the late 16th century. If indeed she did stay at that inn, it is perfectly possible that she would attend services at St. Martin's. But there would have been another very compelling reason for her to visit, and that was to meet this person. Samuel Purkess, the rector by 1616, he was the rector of St. Martin's within Ludgate. Purkess had, in 1613, published a very substantial work, Purkess's Pilgrimage, a lengthy folio volume of more than 750 pages that had been printed by William Stansby and published by Henry Featherstone, both successful members in their own quite different ways of the Stationers' Company. So this is the title page of Purkess's Pilgrimage. Unfortunately, I can't actually see Stansby and Featherstone mentioned right at the bottom, but trust me, they are. This book was an attempt to describe travels of Englishmen abroad and the people's cultures, and particularly the religions they encountered. Purkess's Pilgrimage had been a great success. James I claimed to have read it 7 times. I mean, what else was he doing with his time, quite honestly, to read this enormously long book 7 times? A second edition appeared in 1614 and a third edition in 1617. Purkess had somewhat cleverly dedicated the book to George Abbot, Archbishop of Canterbury, himself an amateur geographer. Here's Abbot, almost certainly the only Archbishop of Canterbury in modern times to kill anybody. I have to point out that it was an accident, but it's well documented. It's not unreasonable to assume that the dedication of this book, with its emphasis on the study of foreign religions, was designed to secure Abbot's favour, and a convenient appointment as rector of St. Martin's was the consequence for Purkess. He described this benefice as offering, quote, the opportunities of books, of conference and manifold intelligence, the best seated in the world for his convenience. Quite clearly, he had aimed for this parish, this church, in order to get close to the centre of the book-selling world, the printing world, and perhaps even Stationers' Hall. Purkess's appointment to the rectorship of St. Martin's positioned him well to embark on a bigger project. He based his first book, The Pilgrimage, on personal interviews with Englishmen who had travelled abroad, on vast quantities of manuscripts, and on access to travelogues already in print, very notably that of the principal voyages of Richard Hakluyt, whom we've already encountered. This is a rather modern stained glass representation of Hakluyt, but a nice one for all that. Purkess had not had personal contact with Hakluyt prior to the publication of the first edition of The Pilgrimage, and could only draw on Hakluyt's published material. But by the time of the publication of the second edition of The Pilgrimage in 1614, he had made personal contact with Hakluyt, who gave him access to manuscript material. Purkess also reported seeing a large map of China in Hakluyt's rooms, and would subsequently acquire it and many of Hakluyt's most precious manuscripts, as we shall see. He also conducted interviews with Englishmen who had travelled to remote regions. These included the celebrated Captain John Smith, whose story of Pocahontas and how she had saved his life had made him a celebrity in his own right. In this copperplate engraving with its somewhat adulatory verse beneath, Smith stares straight out at us, tough, direct, bold, confident, and not at all shy of self-promotion. He's almost the model for the modern Royal Marine. The man of action, quite in contrast to the armchair geographer Hakluyt. Smith's first memoir of the foundation of the Jamestown settlement had initially been published in 1608 anonymously, to be followed by his map of Virginia with a description of the country in 1614. While Smith was prepared to let Purkess see his material, and it was cited extensively in the first edition of 1613 of Purkess's Pilgrimage, he was clearly not going to let Purkess reproduce the material in full, much less the map, until Smith himself had benefited from the full impact of prior publication. Purkess was, however, able to reproduce the map in his later book, Purkess's Pilgrims, published in 1625, which we will explore in depth later. So Smith's famous map of Virginia, which we will now show, please, Lucy. Hello. I wonder, here we go, that's it. So this was the first serious map of Virginia, and well, I'm sorry, this is not a brilliant reproduction. It's quite a faint printing. It's obviously faded very significantly, but I think you can get a sense from this of the sheer detail that it's gone into it. And so it was quite a smash hit when it was first published. But notably, in the top left-hand corner, you can see a representation of Powhatan, the Sachem, or chief of the tribe of that name, the Powhatan Tribal Confederation, who was the father of Pocahontas. And this next slide, slide 9, gives you a bit more detail. This was Smith's recollection of Pocahontas's father when Smith was delivered to him a prisoner. So it did appear in Purkis's later book, The Pilgrims, rather than the early 1613 edition of the Pilgrimage, the first book that he produced. But in that 1613 book, Purkis did not relate the story of Pocahontas. That seems not to have made much of an impression. But he did retail details on did relate details on the religious rituals, the tribal organization, the medicines and agricultural economy of the indigenous peoples of Virginia. And he also described Powhatan, his family, and the rules of succession within the tribe. But Pocahontas doesn't make any appearance in that 1613 book. But she clearly did make an impression during her visit to London. And we know for a fact that Purkis met her because he later recollected that she did not only accustom herself to civility, but still carried herself as the daughter of a king and was accordingly respected not only by the Virginia Company, which allowed provision for herself and for her son, but of divers particular persons of honour. Whether they met in St. Martin's or not, and it would seem a not unreasonable assumption that they did meet there, presumably when she attended services, we know from his later publications that he was present when she met Dr. John King, Bishop of London. As Purkis reported, the Lord Bishop of London, Dr. King, entertained her with festival state and pomp. Poor Matoaka was never to return to her native country. Shortly after, she took ship with Rolfe for Jamestown, but fell ill and got no further than Gravesend, where she died. For Purkis, who had obtained his information about the various peoples of the world either from books, manuscripts, or Englishmen returning from abroad, the opportunity to meet Pocahontas, one of the celebrities of the Jamestown story, must have been a truly memorable experience. At times I sort of imagine how he might have been on that occasion. Was he awestruck? Was he slightly nervous? Was he condescending? We just don't know, but it must have been for him a remarkable occasion to meet somebody from these countries, these lands, which he'd never himself visited. So also amongst Purkis's many sources, and there are far too many to name here, was the eccentric but intrepid Thomas Corriott. He was a native of Somerset, he was well educated, but apparently he was something of a clown. Presumed to be one of the Cyrenaic gentlemen, a drinking club for literary men meeting at the Mermaid Inn near Cheapside, he mingled with the likes of Ben Jonson and John Donne, but seems not to have been taken seriously by them. Here's an image of Corriott that was reproduced, in fact, by Purkis's publisher, Henry Featherstone, this was a publication of the letters of Corriott sent back from India. Anyway, Corriott was an inveterate traveller. He'd wandered around Europe, much of it on foot, in 1608. And in 1612, he set off on a much more ambitious journey, walking to Istanbul and then on to Persia, and finally reaching Mughal India in 1616. A journey difficult enough to imagine now and so much more difficult to achieve then. From India, Coryat sent back accounts of his journey, published by Henry Featherstone, which included a salutation to Purkis, so he'd obviously met him, a salutation to Purkis as the great collector of the lucubrations of sundry classical authors for the description of Asia, Africa, and America. So by 1616 then, Purkis had a reputation in certain circles for being an obsessive acquirer of this kind of information. Purkis quoted this personal greeting in his own 1625 book, Pilgrims, and published in that book further material from Coryat, who had died in India in 1617. Yet another totally different source of knowledge for Purkis was the leading English jurist of the 17th century, John Selden. Rather an austere, deeply scholarly man. Sorry, being interrupted here. Selden was a deep student of legal systems, and in particular of the Jewish legal system in antiquity. And from that point, he became interested in Hebrew and other Eastern cultures and languages. So Selden made the first tentative steps to introduce the literate reader in England to some of these languages in his book, Titles of Honour. And here is a page I've selected from Titles of Honour. This was the first book printed in England, and tellingly it was printed by Stansby, who was Purkis's own chosen printer. Here Stansby has coped with Selden's requirement to reproduce words in Syriac, which is the second line from the top, and then Arabic a bit further down, and then also in the middle of the page. They are pretty clumsy reproductions, but they're quite brave in a sense, even to undertake them. But I mean, if you are familiar with those languages, you can see errors in the Arabic. They're not at all well produced. And it leads one to conclude that Selden himself was unable to proofread the text. But nevertheless, Stansby is appearing here very early on as somebody willing to take on the challenge of reproducing exotic Oriental languages. 20 years later, Stansby and Selden had moved on dramatically in their ability to reproduce Oriental languages, and we'll come to that a bit later on as it sheds some context on the discussion. There's been discussion about, there's been speculation regarding the relationship between Selden and Purkis, just as there has been on the relationship between Purkis and Hakluyt. Selden was plainly close to Purkis at the time of the publication of the first edition of the Pilgrimage in 1613, as he provided a Latin sonnet for the introduction. But it's been suggested that Purkis misused or misrepresented Selden's contribution on the history of the Jews, and that this led to a falling out. The success of the Pilgrimage and the extraordinary network of sources he had built up, however, encouraged and enabled Purkis to produce an even larger work, and that's what we're going to come on to discuss now. So this relatively obscure until now rector of St. Martin's now went on to edit a huge book called Purkis's Pilgrims, printed by Stansby, probably the only printer in London capable of dealing with the vast volumes of material involved and willing to take the risk of producing Oriental languages. So it was printed by Stansby and published in 1625 by Henry Featherstone. And this was the same team which produced the Pilgrimage. But the Pilgrims was at about 4 million words in 4 volumes, the longest book printed in England since the introduction of printing by Caxton. Not only was it immensely long, but unlike the pilgrimage, it included many maps, illustrations, and foreign scripts previously unknown in England, demanding a large number of expensive woodcuts to be produced. Some of these woodcuts were reproductions from books that had already been published. For example, this reproduction of the Pyramids and Sphinx of Egypt from The Relation of a Journey by Sir George Sandys, the first book printed in England to represent the pyramids. And then there's this whimsical representation of a zebra, or a zevra, as it's described here. A nice image, not the first one of a zebra to be published in England, but if I were to show you the image of the previous one, I think we would all respect this very plain black and white image all the more as being realistic. The other one is a continental image that looks like a sort of candy striped Gucci handbag. So elsewhere, Purkis includes a map of Svalbard or Spitsbergen, and around the edges, vignettes representing the process of whaling. Again, this is not the first representation of a whale in an English printed book, but it was the first representation of the industry of whaling. I think there can't be any doubt that Purkis's contribution to the world of linguistic study was more significant than it was in zoology or archaeology. But it was, we have to be frank, largely based on the work of continental scholars who were decades, if not generations, ahead of England at this time in these studies. Here in Purkis's Pilgrims is a table, and there are many such tables of these in the book, representing the alphabets of 11 languages, including those of the Ge'ez script of Ethiopia, which is on the extreme left, and Egyptian Coptic, which is in there somewhere. And they would probably, as far as I can make out, the first attempt to represent most of them on the printed page in England. So he was really helping to sort of break new ground and bring the English up to speed with information on Oriental languages and so on. But whilst he was reproducing this material, he would also fall for what can only be described as some sort of linguistic prank. So if we go on to slide 16, if you look at number 37, the bottom row, he describes this in the key underneath as the Gallo-Grecian alphabet. In other words, the Greek that was used by settlers in southern France before the Romans arrived. Now, it only takes us a few seconds to see that this isn't Greek in any sense. It is simply the classic Latin alphabet of 23 letters with the top chipped off. So they just concealed the top part of the letter and grooved away to somehow conceal the origins of, not very effectively, of this alphabet. And in this sense, in this context, poor old Purkis hasn't applied any sort of critical check as an editor of all this stuff. He's just accepted it at face value. And this is a problem that keeps occurring in the assessment of Purkis as an editor, that he didn't apply very strenuous editorial critical facilities in dealing with this kind of material. Here's another one. This is quite an interesting one in quite a different context. Number 20 at the top, you see, is a fairly short alphabet, but at the extremities of each letter, there's a small circle. And this alphabet had first appeared in about 1520, so nearly 100 years before Purkis's book was published, or just over 100 years. And it's known generally as the Celestial alphabet. And the idea is that the Celestial alphabet demonstrates letters that join the stars. So the idea, so if you understood how to read the letters that were formed between the stars, you could literally read what was written in the stars. And this Celestial alphabet really held people's attention for a very long time. So nearly 150 years, it kept on cropping up in various books by very serious scholars. And here again, Purkes has simply reproduced it from a continental book. I have done a short article on this subject of the celestial alphabet, and it appears that's on my website if anybody's curious about it. So another of Purkes's voracious appetite for samples of exotic languages is this, John Sarris's Japanese petition. And this was the first bid for a trading agreement with Japan. So Sarris was an East India Company merchant captain who undertook the very first visit to Japan in 1613. And on arrival there, he put out feelers, made contacts, and sought to submit a petition requesting a presumably free trade agreement with Japan. I think it's generally accepted that he was helped in this by the famous Will Adams, the so-called English samurai, who was at that time living in Japan and helped to translate. But this document, which was a petition, not the first trading charter, was handed, or a copy of it was handed to Purkes so that he could reproduce it in his book, The Pilgrims. And the interesting thing is, of course, that neither Purkes nor probably anyone else in England at the time was able to read Japanese, yet he chose to include it in the book as a sample of that language, and noted that he'd compared it to Chinese characters. He concluded that while they were not Chinese, they operated in the same way as Chinese rather than as an alphabetic system. And he finishes by throwing open a challenge to his audience. Take them, thou reader, and judge them better if thou canst. While Purkes's reproduction was not that of the original trading charter, neither he nor others in England at that time were capable of knowing any better. When in 1671 another mission was sent to Japan in an attempt to re-establish trade, which had obviously slumped between the two countries, the mission was provided with a tracing of the text from Purkes's book by way of accreditation to the Japanese authorities. So it's clear that Purkes's Pilgrims was seen as an authoritative record. Now, to come on to something that is even more dazzling, the manuscript of which Purkes was most proud, he described it as the choicest of my jewels, was this, the Codex Mendoza. So the Codex Mendoza was commissioned by the first Spanish Viceroy of the Americas, and it was designed to be sent back to Europe for the Habsburg Emperor Charles V. It was illustrated by native Aztec artists and has a Spanish translation of the pictograms. So in that sense, this is a step forward beyond the Japanese text, because there was no translation of the Japanese text. When it was on way to the Habsburg Emperor, the ship that it was on was captured by French pirates, and from them the codex passed to André Thevet, the French king's cosmographer. On Thevet's death, Hakluyt, who had met the Frenchman during his time as the chaplain at the English embassy in Paris, had acquired it, but apparently couldn't afford to have the images reproduced for his own book. So the image on the right, I should point out, is one of the Bodleian Library's own images. The Bodleian is where the original Codex Mendoza is now held. And at the top, you can see the name André Thevet, Cosmographe du Roi, so cosmographer to the king. And on the left is this reproduction from Purkes's Pilgrims. I should point out that the illustrations used in this talk are from the Library of Congress's digitized versions of Purkes's Pilgrims. But look how much effort has gone into reproducing this complicated set of images. And in fact, the following 50 pages or so in Purkes's Pilgrims are dedicated to reproductions of the Codex Mendoza. So it was it was so significant for him that he was rather pleased with himself in that he was able to report that he had obtained the cutting of the images for the press, i.e. in a way that Hakluyt hadn't been able to. In fact, it was almost certainly Purkis's publisher, Henry Featherstone, who'd financed the woodcuts. I should mention that when Hakluyt died, the Codex Mendoza, when Hakluyt died, the Codex passed to Purkis, and when Purkis died, it passed to Selden, and that's how it eventually its route into the Bodleian. So now it's important to note one aspect of this publication of the Codex Mendoza, and that was this: that in this one area of publication, in bringing the Aztec written script to publication, Purkis and his publisher Featherstone, with their printer Stansby, had for the first time put England ahead in the dissemination of knowledge about remote cultures and languages. I mean, we were decades behind, for instance, the Jesuits in investigating and studying Chinese and Japanese. The Jesuits were exploring very exotic languages in South America, like Guarani, but the English, for the first time, in bringing the Aztec language to, or any Aztec documents to publication, had for the first time nosed ahead of continental competitors. Turning now to the other end of the earth, Purkis challenged Western perceptions of the geography of China. Featherstone, his publisher, during his business travels on the continent, and I'll come to those a little bit later on, had purchased the plates produced by the engraver and mapmaker Jodocus Hondius for the latter's Atlas Minor, originally published in 1606, and many of these were used in Purkis's Pilgrims. But Purkis had had the opportunity to study Hondius's map of China, which shows Korea as an island rather than a peninsula, and positions it to the south of China rather than to the east. He compared it to maps of Chinese origin. We should remember here that he'd seen one such hanging on the walls of Hakluyt's chambers. And he compared it in particular to one map which he, Purkis himself, now owned. And he noted that what was shown as the south coast of China in Hondius's map became the east coast in a Chinese map representing Korea, now as a peninsula to the east. So you can see Great Korea there on the right-hand side, or is it Gorai Korea on the right-hand side as a peninsula. So altogether, a vast step forward in reproduction of maps. Not the very best map of China at the time, but what Purkis did was he included both maps in his Pilgrims so that readers could make the comparison for themselves. The plate prepared for printing from the original Chinese map omitted almost all of the Chinese characters because Purkis explained readers would not be able to understand them. And that was an editorial judgment which he did not apply, for instance, to the document in Japanese. So he was inconsistent there in his presentation of foreign script. But cartography was a preoccupation, and Purkis was able to arrange for a new engraving of a map of India prepared by the explorer William Baffin in collaboration with the English ambassador to the Mughal court, Sir Thomas Roe, to be included in his new book, The Pilgrims. And it's worth also noting that the archives of the East India Company record multiple meetings between Purkis and the court of the East India Company as he requested access to the company's records, and specifically the reports of Roe. So he was requesting access to these records in about 1622, 1623. And interestingly, a very significant director of the East India Company was Maurice Abbott, who was the brother of George Abbott, the Archbishop of Canterbury. So there was a network that Purkis was able to call on to provide him with access to all sorts of material, including East India Company records. So here we have the Baffin Roe map of India. first published in 1620, so Purkis's publication of it wasn't the first publication. But this was the first English map of India and the basis for all further English maps of India for the next 100 years. So its inclusion in Purkis's Pilgrims added to the book's status as an authoritative compilation of contemporary geography and cultural material. The length of the book, the quantity of maps involved, the reproduction of exotic scripts and images, which had never before been published in England, demanded not only capable engravers, compositors, and press capacity, but also a willing publisher. Purkis, of course, already worked with Henry Featherstone on his earlier book, The Pilgrimage of 1613, and on its subsequent editions. But this time, the debt was on quite a different scale. Purkis lauded Featherstone's adventurous courage so long to bear this my heavy world at such expense. So Featherstone was as essential to the publication of this massive item of world geography and history as was the compiler Purkis. Who was Featherstone? Well, he was born about 1584 and he was the son of this person, Cuthbert Featherstone, ferocious, intimidating looking Elizabethan, who was gentleman usher to Queen Elizabeth I. Featherstone Senior traced his origins back to the northeast of England and claimed to be a member of the Fanshawe, spelt Featherstone-Hall, but pronounced Fanshawe family, a claim which would eventually land Henry in some trouble. Henry was apprenticed in 1598 to Bonham Norton, King's printer, and one of the printers of the King James Version Bible. Featherstone may have started his career as a stationer with more capital than the average recently free stationer. At the end of what must have been a rather lengthy 9-year apprenticeship rather than 7, Henry set up shop at the Sign of the Rose in St. Paul's Churchyard. Although he did have some noticeable publishing successes, quite often with devotional works until 1620, it seems that Featherstone was more successful as a bookseller with international connections. From 1621 to 1632, he acted as chief agent in purchasing books for the Bodleian, travelling regularly to the continent, buying at the Frankfurt Book Fair, in Venice, and at the Officina Plantiniana in Antwerp. It was during these buying trips on the continent that he purchased the plates for the Hondius maps already discussed. In 1625, he was the single most significant importer of books to London, and in that year sold books to the value of £23 to the Bodleian. To put this in perspective, this amount would be the equivalent of almost a year's worth of salary for a skilled worker. Amongst the important items he imported from the continent was the Barocci collection of Greek manuscripts dating from the 10th to the 17th century. These were eventually purchased by the Earl of Pembroke for Oxford University and are now at the Bodleian. Another extraordinary acquisition by Featherstone was a complete 16th century copy of the Babylonian Talmud. It's seen here. So the Babylonian Talmud was printed by Daniel Bomberg, a citizen of Antwerp who'd obtained a license to print in Venice. And his printing of the Talmud, completed over the period 1519 to 1523, is considered one of the most important printings in Hebrew at any time. If we take a look here at a sample of the pages, you can see that the layout and the clarity of the Hebrew text here is fantastic. And it's quite interesting if you cast your mind back to the attempts by Stansby to print Syriac and Arabic that were in clumsy woodcut. Here you see something printed nearly 100 years earlier in practically immaculate quality printing. There are only 14 copies of this complete work preserved today. The Featherstone copy was purchased in 1629 for Sion College Library for £26. So again, a bit more than the average income of a skilled worker in 1 year. And that copy is now in the library at Lambeth Palace. and it appears in Featherstone's 1628 catalogue of books for sale, which is the earliest surviving printed trade list in England, and preserved again in the Bodleian. Now it's worth just digressing a moment here. Academics don't always appreciate and attempt to measure the worth of a book by the price it fetches at auction. But nevertheless, I can't resist mentioning that 5 years ago, a complete copy of the Babylonian Talmud printed by Bomberg, once owned by Westminster Abbey, was bought by a private New York buyer at auction for $9 million, reflecting the scarcity of the book, the excellence of the print, and its importance to Hebrew bibliography. Trade in books in Oriental languages was clearly a major area of interest for Featherstone, and books in the more exotic languages, including Coptic and Chaldean, appeared in his catalogues. He was also a generous benefactor to his major customers, donating 37 Hebrew books to the Bodleian and books and globes to Sion College. Now, it's fun, again, to speculate here. Were they free samples of what he had to offer? Well, that's a jolly large pack of free samples. Was it a thank you for good business or part of another deal? Or indeed, were these donations sweeteners to induce more commissions? You know, perhaps all three. But the catalogue listings point towards Featherstone's understanding of what institutions wanted. Featherstone was plainly very successful, accumulating farms and other estates in the countryside and tenements in London and elsewhere. Commercial success was matched by social aspiration. Cuthbert Featherstone, the father, had claimed a link with the prestigious Fanshawe family in the north of England, and this seems to have rubbed off on Henry. In 1635, the College of Arms, or the Kings of Arms, were alerted by the Fanshawe family to the fact that their coat of arms, seen here, had been displayed by Henry Featherstone on the commemorative bust set up to the memory of his father Cuthbert Featherstone in St Dunstan's in the West Church, only a couple of 100 yards from St Martin's. This is the part of the evidence pack, and it's still held at the College of Arms. And this is the coat of arms that Henry Featherstone seems to have used illicitly. So the College of Arms, the Fanshawe family were quite understanding, and they thought that the use of the arms had been more a result of ignorance than malice, and they appear to have thought that Featherstone himself was a gentleman, but the College of Arms found against Featherstone and concluded that he was, quote, no gentleman. So the bust can still be seen in St Dunstan's, just down the road from where we currently are not. And there is no sign of any unmerited arms. There they are, that's his bust. They were probably removed or covered over. So we don't know actually what penalty was imposed by the College of Arms, but Featherstone was not the sort of man to take a beating. And what's more, he was no shrinking violet. Between 1618 and 1621, there are references in the Stationers' Company archives to his keeping foreigners in his house or shop. And in the City of London's trade terminology of the time, if I remember correctly, from Peter Blaney's attempts to drum this into people like me, a foreigner was someone who was not a freeman of the City of London, and therefore was not entitled to engage in retail activities in the city. The court imposed a fine, but Featherstone utterly refused, and that's the word that's used, utterly refused to comply. And so the court instructed that he should be denied access to books of the English stock, of which he was a shareholder, until he complied. Despite his difficulties with the company and with the College of Arms, Featherstone progressed in business and up the hierarchy of the Stationers' Company. In 1641, as the country leaned increasingly towards a conflict between King and Parliament, Featherstone was elected master. In November of the same year, he became a member of the East India Company and invested £500, the equivalent today of about £60,000, in a trading voyage to Bantam in the East Indies. That gives a clear indication of his huge financial success. The Stationers' Company, it gives some archives give some indication of the emergence of problems during Featherstone's mastership. Unnamed individuals complained to Parliament about the general management of the company, and in doing so revealed trade secrets. It may well have been Featherstone himself who approached Parliament, because it is quite clear that he was a parliamentary supporter in its clash with the king. On the 21st of October 1642, Featherstone made a personal contribution to Parliament's trained bands under General Philip Skippon in defence of London against Charles I's forces. So the very top entry here for 21st of October, on the left-hand side, it shows Major Skippon. Well, he was Major General Skippon, a professional soldier who commanded on the parliamentary side. And it goes on then to describe Henry Featherstone of Blackfriars, stationer, and it describes his contribution: 2 bay geldings, pistols, carbines, swords, and 2 buff coats, valued at £50, one of only 2 entries on the day valued that high. So with the civil war erupting around them, the stationers continued to squabble over rights to printing of books they perceived as profitable. In 1642, Featherstone, no longer master, led a group that made a bid to take personal control of the printing of a new version of the King James Bible, with marginal notes taken from the Geneva Bible. In the event, the bid failed, and the next edition of the Bible to be printed was preserved as a monopoly of the company as a whole. But the activities of Featherstone and his group became increasingly radical, attempting to replace the entire court of assistants, although the details are very shadowy. This appears to have been Featherstone's last attempt to capture a big prize. 2 years later, he was dead, leaving considerable properties to his children and fellow stationer George Thomason, who received Featherstone's quarter share in a ship called the Philip. Purkis could hardly have had a better publisher than Featherstone. He was successful in business and had deep pockets. He had excellent connections on the continent, who could supply books and other materials. In England, he had similarly excellent contacts at the leading institutions collecting scholarly material, and therefore a good grasp of a small but growing market. The success of Purkis's first book, The Pilgrimage, convinced Featherstone that he was onto a good thing in underwriting Purkis's Pilgrims. So there was an editor of boundless curiosity and an optimistic publisher with deep pockets. All that was missing now was a printer up to the task. Of course, they'd both worked with Stansby. I ought to insert a footnote here and to mention that really probably the expert on William Stansby as a printer is our fellow stationer, Dr. Mark Bland, who very kindly has helped me with 1 or 2 things in bibliographical terms. So you can Google Mark's contributions on Stansby, and I think he also did the Oxford Dictionary's entry on Stansby. So Stansby was born in Exeter in 1572. He was the son of a cutler. He was apprenticed in 1590 to the stationer John Windott from the same parish in Exeter. He, on his freedom, Stansby elected to remain with Windott, and by 1609 had become a partner, probably because he'd invested a new set of Roman font as an alternative to the black letter which Windott's press habitually used. As Stansby became increasingly influential over the direction of the Windott press, the standard output of devotional works was replaced by the works of the leading lights of English literature at the time: Donne, Johnson, Bacon, and Raleigh, amongst others. In matters of typography and the output of the print shop then, Stansby was forward-looking, perhaps not in comparison with continental printers, but certainly in comparison with many other print shops in London. And it was this vision and an interest in new challenges that made him the ideal printer for Purkis's Pilgrims. The examples are numerous, but here I note only a few of them. So I'm going to sort of try and move on a little bit here. Lucy, we could go on to the next. Amongst Stansby's works were these: the Laws Divine, Moral and Martial for the colony in Virginia, the first laws printed for the English-speaking settlements in England. And to move on to slide 30, here we go. Yes, this is an example of Stansby's willingness to deal with various fonts in a single, in fact, within 5 lines here. You can see that he is using Roman font, italics, back to Roman, then into 2 lines of Greek, followed by Roman, and then into Hebrew. And you can imagine the complexity of dealing with that, and what a challenge it must have been for the compositors and for the so-called corrector, the proofreader at the time. So he was therefore not an entrepreneur as Featherstone was, but he was an excellent manufacturer in terms of investing, improving capabilities, moving forward with market demand, and in the process accepting new challenges. But like Featherstone, he got into trouble with the Stationers' Company, and this was almost the norm back then, it seems to me at times. He got into trouble for binding an apprentice at a scrivener's rather than at the Hall, for entertaining or employing foreigners, English citizens not freemen of the City of London. Here is an example of him being fined for the Stationers' Company, by the Stationers' Company, for using unfitting words to the master. Well, we certainly wouldn't do that now, would we? There were other problems, the most significant of which took place in about sometime between 1620 and 1622, when he got into trouble for printing a pamphlet critical of the Holy Roman Emperor. This led to him having his print shop and warehouse nailed up at the orders of the wardens of the Stationers' Company, and at least of his presses being broken up. So he had taken something of a risk in the past, and that influenced his future behavior, because at one point Purkis, very late in the printing of Purkis's Pilgrims, tried to agree with the East India Company that there would be some new material inserted into the book relating to the massacre of East India Company officials in Batavia in the East Indies, and the printer Stansby refused to do it, and he said it was too sensitive to do so. And there has to be some speculation that maybe he didn't want to do it because he'd got himself so much into trouble with the printing of the material on the Holy Roman Emperor. Moving on to 32, and we're not too far from the end, people will be relieved to know. Towards the end of his life, after a long period when he'd had a reputation of being a very competent printer, very capable, and chosen by some of the most demanding people of the time, including Ben Jonson, for whom Stansby published and printed the very important first folio of Jonson's works. He got into trouble with the English stockkeepers because his printing of the Middelburg Psalms was deemed to be not fit for purpose, and the court of the company upheld this claim and took the job away from him and told him to pass all the paper to another printer and to bear the costs of what he'd done so far. Now, this is really unusual for a man who was really capable of taking on some tough challenges. And in fact, if we look on a bit to the next extract, this is from John Selden again, the jurist, and this is in Selden's this is from Selden's book, Mare Clausum, The Closed Sea, which was a really important work of international relations relating to the rights of countries to territorial waters and so on. And here you can see that Stansby has moved on vast amounts from his early clumsy attempts to reproduce woodcut images of Arabic. Here he's using, for the very first time in England, Arabic movable type, and it's very clear and it's very neatly reproduced. But it is worth noting that the last 3 words of Arabic in this paragraph, you can see, have been justified to the left. Well, of course, Arabic is read right to left, so they should have been justified on the right-hand side of the page. And that simply confirms that, of course, understandably, the proofreader and the corrector were not able to read Arabic. It also suggests that Selden himself did not or was not able to proofread. Now, I'm very conscious of the fact this is going on rather a long time. And so I want to sort of try and bring things now to a conclusion. I've already mentioned that the East India Company had used Purkis's Pilgrim's Japanese text in their attempt to recover trade lost with Japan. But they also sent a copy to their library in India in 1686 as an important, reliable reference document. And in the 1750s, when France and England were fighting over sovereignty of Canada and were trying to reach, during a period of peace, agreement on negotiated boundaries of Nova Scotia, both sides, not just the one side, but both sides, used Purkis's works for reference. So just then wrapping up, what in this 400th anniversary year of the Mayflower can we say about Purkis, Pocahontas and the Plymouth settlement? Was there any connection? Well, I think there may have been. When Pocahontas visited London in 1616, Stansby and Featherstone were not the only stationers with an interest in the New World. The stationer John Beale was at this time printing works for the Virginia Company publisher William Welby. And amongst Beale's apprentices was this chap, Edward Winslow. Well, this is him somewhat later in life, but he was an apprentice of Beale. Winslow eventually broke out of his apprenticeship and went to Leiden in the Netherlands, where he assisted in the printing of the separatists' tracts and documents over there, and became a very leading member of the Mayflower Pilgrims, and in fact was 3 times governor of Plymouth settlement, and subsequently a very leading member of Cromwell's parliamentary sort of administrators. Now, the interesting thing to finish up on then is to speculate, did Winslow, who would have almost certainly seen things being printed relating to the New World in his work during his apprenticeship, did he see Pocahontas during her visit? It's quite possible. The Fetter Lane print shop of John Beale was only 7 minutes away from the Savage Inn or St. Martin's. But the nice thing that wraps it all up is that after some years in New England, Winslow rose to become one of the key writers recording the history and the adventures of the Plymouth settlers, to the extent that we can find 2 works written by him in the archives of the Stationers' Company, and he became such a significant authority on the New World, particularly the Plymouth settlement, that he merited recognition as a serious authority on that settlement. And you can see here again from the digital images of the Library of Congress's copies of Purkis's Pilgrimage, that Winslow's books were incorporated, were included in Purkis's Pilgrims. So he'd risen from an obscure apprenticeship during Pocahontas's visit to prominence in the New World, so that the Mayflower Pilgrim had risen to become one of Purkis's Pilgrims. And that, everybody will be pleased to hear, is the end of the talk itself. I'm not sure if we have some time. I hope we have some time for some questions. I'm going to sort of try and take those, and when we've finished off with those, I think the Master would appropriately, as a former chaplain of St. Martin's, like to wrap up. So we've got one attendee. I said the Archbishop of Canterbury killed someone. Can I elaborate? Yes. It was a hunting accident. He was out, I don't know where it was, but he was armed with a crossbow and entirely by accident managed to shoot and kill a gamekeeper. And the moral of that story is only that you should never let clergymen too near firearms. There's another question here. And £9 million, in fact it was $9 million for the Babylonian Talmud. Are there any such gems of rare books in the stationer's library or archive? What is the jewel in the stationer's library? Well, the jewel, in my view, is the archive rather than the library. If we had managed to preserve a copy of everything produced at the peak of the sort of English Renaissance, we would be extremely wealthy. As it is, those books were never preserved. We have quite a modest library collection, but the archive is the real gem, and it's of international significance. I'm going to try to go now to questions that may have been put on the chat line, or maybe not. Somebody, Stephen Collins, observed that the page with the poor woodcuts of Arabic and Syriac also had one word in Hebrew which was much better quality, not inferior to that in the Bomberg Talmud. I would defer to other people on this. Of course, Hebrew had been studied much earlier in England. There were readerships at Oxford and Cambridge in Hebrew back in the 1530s, and professorships, I think chairs were founded in about 1540s, and there was no readership in Arabic until about the 1630s. So people had been at it much longer, but I'm interested in your observation, Stephen, that the Hebrew was of much better quality. And you, Stephen, also notes that what I described as the celestial alphabet are described in the footnote as the Kabbalistical. In fact, there are three of those kind of alphabets described as the Kabbalistic. He doesn't describe the topmost one, which is number 20, as the celestial alphabet, but I know that's how it is described in many other documents, right up to the time of the publications of Athanasius Kircher, the Jesuit, described as the last man of the Renaissance. He was describing it as the celestial alphabet. So it's one of a group. The group is known as Kabbalistic. The single one at the top is the celestial alphabet. I think a few more questions may have popped up. One from Margaret, the portrait of Cuthbert Featherstone, who painted it and where is it? I have to confess, I have not tracked that detail down. It is, to be precise, described as sort of probably or likely to be or said to be Cuthbert Featherstone. Personally, I believe when you compare it to the bust in St Dunstan's, I'm pretty certain it is Cuthbert Featherstone. I think we're now coming to the end of the questions, and rather than listen to me wrap up, everybody will be relieved to hear from the Master. So I'll hand it over to the Master.
I hope you can all hear me. Paul, can you hear me?
Very clearly.
Oh, thank you. Well, Paul, thank you so much for an extraordinary tour de force. And it sounds to me as you might have had even more material to offer at some other time. I'm not really, I'm certainly in no, I have no qualifications for responding to you, but I do have a couple of excuses. And one excuse is that I was, as you said, for a couple of years, the chaplain at St. Martin within Ludgate. And the other was that I was for 5.5 years what people used to describe as the Archbishop of Canterbury's Foreign Secretary, doing my own little bit of engaging the church with abroad, as the English would always call it. Just a couple of reflections. One that's interesting is that Purkis was chaplain to George Abbott. Purkis showing an extraordinary interest in such a wealth of things, a broad sympathy for many things. Abbott was very much the opposite and rather narrow-minded, and certainly very unsure about Roman Catholics and anyone outside the Church of England, really. As you say, he was, I think, probably the only Archbishop of Canterbury who could ever be convicted of unintended homicide. But the interesting thing as well is that Hakluyt has an interesting parallel here, because he was the chaplain to the ambassador in France in the late 16th century. And almost exactly 100 years on, William Wake was the chaplain to the then ambassador, the envoy extraordinary, Lord Preston. And Wake was one of the first people really to make significant moves as an archbishop to onto the international scene. I suppose the thing I found fascinating was the way that you compared at the beginning England with other European nations at that point. And perhaps some similar things were beginning to happen very slowly in terms of the Church of England's reaction to international affairs. Certainly it did take off, because it eventually resulted in what's called the Anglican Communion, which I think is the second most widespread of any of the churches within Christendom. Thank you so much for this. I'll now want to go away and look up just a few of these things. Just really amazing, going right through to the alphabets and the Babylonian Talmud, so many different strands. Paul, thank you very much indeed for a marvellous lecture.
My pleasure, and thank you very much, Master.